So let me kind of start with what the problem that we've been trying to deal with, and then kind of outline our solution, the solution we pose for how to get beyond some of the limitations. In the previous conversations, we've questioned the theory and the methods of race and discussed the history and the impact of the visual representation of race. In this conversation, I'd like to turn our attention to problems and issues in defining Africa and the African diaspora in the context of the racial politics that exist in our globalized world today. So I will distinguish between the ideas of African descent, the Black Atlantic, and the African diaspora as a way of outlining how we can talk about these things, and what I think is move to a conversation which is a little more critical and a little more enhanced in terms of issues related to being humans on the planet. I start with the idea that African descent refers to people who come from Africa, that is, to descend from Africa, to have some heritage in Africa. And the story of the study of human origins has taken a definite turn towards a monogenetic origin of humanity. This monogenetic origin means we all originated in the same place. That place is Africa. So to be of African descent, literally, not politically, because I know people use this term in a more political way to define a population which I will refer to a little bit later as the African diaspora. But this is the point, and I won't belabor it, and we can talk about it more if you like, but that basically humanity began in Africa, and that the first movement among humanity was around Africa. It was intercontinental migration. Africa today that we see has a different landmass than it did in the past, but that land mass still was Africa. And these Africans became the seeds, the earth seeds, if you will, for the populations that would inhabit the other areas of the planet. So it is out of Africa that the people in Asia migrated. It is out of Africa that the people in Europe migrated. It is out of Africa that the people in the Americas migrated. Hence, the islands and the various continents were all migrated by populations which have a descent that go to Africa. Therefore, we are all Africans in this sense. And that's for me, I think of this as basically 5 African diasporas. And this would be the first kind of African diaspora, although it's important to recognize that here is where you have an idea of African descent and what it means. And it has a kind of practical, a kind of genetic, a kind of epigenetic, a kind of biological reality which is based in the very notion of the fact that people originated on the continent of Africa. Now, given that technically we are all what I would call African descent, it is important to recognize that as a way of differentiating the politics of identity which have consumed us in this modern period. So there is one biological race of human beings. The African diaspora was created at a time when Africa was redefined to fit into a kind of narrative of empire. This narrative has come to be dominated by the European narrative of humanity, but it is a narrative of empire. At the same historical moment, around 1500, race becomes a very important social process. So it is important for us to think of Africa and to think of the African diaspora within a kind of global context. I'm going to read to you something very briefly. In 2007, the United Nations asked me to write a proposal for what it would look like to put a team together that would write 2 volumes on Africa and the African diaspora. And the first 2 paragraphs, I think, are relevant for a kind of introduction to the 4 additional kind of African diasporas that I will kind of outline here. So let me just read you what I said in this proposal. Ultimately, we didn't do those 2 volumes, and it's just I've been slowly working on the project myself. It was supposed to be a team of about 18 people, so it's hard for me to do the work of 18 people by myself. So if you want to help, just let me know. This is what I wrote then. We live in a strange moment when global capital and commerce have been freed from the binds and constraints of national boundaries, increasingly state control. Yet people and their cultures remain trapped conceptually and sometimes literally within national boundaries. Even though when one looks at his culture, politics, economics, media, and the immigration that's occurring around them, no people or nation is not a creation of the worlds in which they reside. Currently, globalization is mostly understood as an economic reality, capitalism unleashed. But just as important is developing an understanding of people and their cultures from a global perspective that allows us to understand their impact and connectedness to humanity in general. So, in essence, I was trying to develop a project to expose the global interconnections of distinct peoples and cultures, especially those of Africa and the African diaspora. I was trying to argue that these distinct peoples form a global demos, if you will, that live beyond the constraints of the national boundaries and narratives in which they reside. So the project was to recognize that what happens in Haiti, Ghana, and Papua New Guinea are different, but at the same time related and interconnected and need to be understood from a perspective that is global. When one looks at globalized capitalism, there are intense networks, interconnected institutions, methods of inquiry and production that support its movement across the planet. Yet when it comes to understanding distinct but interconnected peoples from a kind of global perspective, these networks are non-existent or weak at best. So I was proposing a project to create the networks, an infrastructure that would produce a kind of multimedia scholarship, pedagogy, and organizations that would allow policymakers, scholars, and the general public to better understand and embrace the global reality of Africa and the African diaspora. So that was the idea I had then. And I've still been working with the idea. And that, if you remember 2007, that's how people were talking in 2007. Everything was about globalization this and globalization that. So I was a child of that time. And I'm probably not going to say globalization again. And so you have to remember what people were calling globalization at that time was an effort to look at the international in an interconnected way. And as people wanted to talk about these very desperate realities that people were living in, and to talk about how the world was getting smaller, in some ways getting flatter, but how that flatness and that smallness still reflected or allowed us to see more clearly our differences and what that would mean in a world where our differences needed to be overcome in order to do things that could help people. So the first African diasporas were created after this initial moment when Africans migrate and interact with Europe and Asia. You know, and the stories that can be told are many here. Hannibal in Carthage, Mansa Musa from Mali, and the many military conflicts between Africa and countries and places in Europe and Asia and India and, you know, many other places. I mean, we have the story of Abdul Muhammad, who becomes he goes as an enslaved soldier to India only to rise up and become the leader of India, the ruler of India. And he and his descendants ruled India, larger part of India, for quite so many years. So, you know, sometimes we forget about these things, or, you know, the Moorish not only colonization but kind of domination of Spain and the area and much of the surrounding area during a time in the past. And the many battles between various groups in Africa and Muslims and others, the enslavement of some Africans, but also the enslavement of Europeans by Africans, of Asians by Africans. At this moment when there was enslavement, the enslavement was not racially based. That is, there wasn't the notion of race. So someone wasn't made a slave simply because they were an African. They could be made a slave for a lot of reasons. The word slave actually originates from Slav, which refers to how so many Slavic folks were being enslaved. So, you know, soldiers, concubines, merchants, you know, and just every kind of interaction you could anticipate, those interactions happened. So the big second African diasporas really originate as a consequence of the Arab slave trade in black bodies. Now this happens between about, you know, 1000 BC to about 1800 BC. And this trade, from all I've seen and all I've been able to calculate, and you can go and read my old papers on this, the number would be between 50 to 75 million people who were involved in this particular trade over this span of years. And these bodies would go through and come from many places, from the Sudan to the coast right outside of Dar es Salaam to, you know, all the way to various parts of the Arabian subcontinent, as well as many going to North Africa, going through Timbuktu, ending up in various areas in North Africa, in Europe, and in other places as a consequence of the directions of this particular slave trade. A third African diaspora comes to us as a consequence of the European slave trade in black bodies. Now this slave trade dates from around 1500 to 1900. And I do note that there were Africans who were enslaved in Portugal, for example, in the 1400s, especially in the latter 1400s. But through the length and life of this particular trade, I estimate that the numbers were between 40 to 50 million people. So the lowest bound of an estimate that I come up with is around 30 million, which is quite much higher than the 10 million that Curtin and his colleagues have professed. But most demographic analysis, all you do is do a demographic analysis of a couple of countries, and you end up with a much higher estimate than they come up with. Now, the fourth African diaspora is a more modern diaspora, because the thing to recognize is that enslavement ends in Cuba in 1886. It ends in Brazil in 1888. So for the most part, the experience of enslavement in the Americas, ranges from 500 all the way up to the end of the 19th century. So that's a period, 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, 400 years of enslavement being the basis of the economies in the Americas and Europe, being the basis of the economies in Europe and the Americas. And it established a base so that even the resources which would have been reaped as a consequence of the kind of brutal exploitation of having people who worked and were not paid, and putting in place systems of torture and coercion to force them to produce the value that they put into the things they produced, were the access wealth that stimulated the financial and industrialization of the world. Of course, the brutal force used to force the many peoples of Asia to engage in serf-like labor, and even, the kind of enslavement that many of the indigenous populations in the Americas experienced, also were very, very important in producing the wealth, in producing the financial context in which industrialization could take place. I don't want to undermine that point. A couple of lectures back, we made that point, and I don't think I emphasized it enough as how important that is for the kind of argument that we're making, because it helps us at least put the experience of the diasporas in a context. The fourth, or if you count the first one, the fifth African diaspora is the diaspora that it comes, we could call it the modern diaspora of the 20th and the 21st centuries. And this is migrations around Africa and the world. So you have on the African continent systems of migration. You have in southern Africa, for example, a system of migration in which you will find a large number of Angolans, Namibians, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans in South Africa. And so for South Africa, this is a major issue, a big social problem, is how do you talk about these immigrants who are African immigrants in a country in which a major ideological basis of the fight against racism was the fact that here is something that is African. And also many of these countries supported that country in its efforts to be liberated. But, as you find in most countries, it develops this narrative about what the immigrants are doing when they come to the country, how they're taking the people's jobs, how they have the criminal tendencies. They're all those, the same conversation that you see everywhere else in the world with immigrants. You get those in Africa and in the various systems of migration that exist on the African continent. So you could say one is the South African system, another is the East African system, another is the West African system, another is the North African system. And then these systems integrate with each other so that there is a great degree of overlap of the systems, but they all have principal locations into which the immigrants go. So South Africa, the Republic of South Africa being one of those particular nodes. And then sometimes it depends on the type of social stability which exists in neighboring countries, which will have a tremendous influence on where migrants go. So that, you know, the Algeria will be experiencing a lot of immigration if there is war and turmoil in Tunisia and in Libya. Morocco will receive a lot of immigrants if there's political turmoil in Mali and Mauritania. So, you know, how people circulate can be influenced by not only the economic necessity of sustaining their lives, but it could also be heavily influenced by the politics in the region, and even environmental factors. When there's a lotus infestation, which occurs quite a bit in the Sahelian region, you will have people dispersing from Mali in very large numbers and going to the various countries which it shares a border with. Now, usually they come back, but it takes some time. If you couple that with the war they recently had or still having in northern Mali, it kind of compounds the impact. It was right before the war started in northern Mali. You will recall that there was you may not recall, but I'll tell you, there was a lotus infestation, and it happens pretty regularly. And that had driven out many of the people from the more arable areas of the north. And then as soon as they came back to settle, you had the fall of Libya. And with the fall of Libya, it had a tremendous impact on the economies and the stability of many of the countries that shared a border with it. One of Gaddafi's principal group of bodyguards, and this numbered in the thousands, it was a very large bodyguard, were composed of Tuareg. The Tuareg who occupied northern Mali now returned home, but they returned home with military equipment and training far superior to that in the country. The president, when he noticed they were coming, because the president had a good relationship with Libya, went to negotiate with them. He negotiated a peace and went home. His military was upset that he did that, because he did it because he knew what they were coming with. And so they overthrew him. There was a coup, and then they started a war with these guys in the north. And the guys in the north kicked them out of the north. And they just stopped at around Mopti. If you know Mali, maybe you don't, I'll assume you don't. They stopped in Mopti. Mopti was about the last place you're going to stop. Next is Ségou. And right after that, you're from Mopti to Bamako, you're half a day away. From Ségou to Bamako, you're just several hours away. So these changes and all of this stuff and people moving out is all related and interconnected to what happens in Libya, what happens in the environment, and where people can move depending upon their own feelings about comfort and where there are already significant numbers of those people. So on the African continent, there is a great degree of circulation of people migrating from place to place. And we need to think of this beyond just the diaspora moving outside of the African continent, to recognize that the migrations within and between African nations are an important type of African diaspora. Migrants continue to go out of Africa to other parts of the world, including the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and all of the Americas. If you're ever in the Middle East, you pick up a newspaper and you read it, you will read many stories about African migrants. I was actually shocked by this the first time I was in the Middle East. But you will read all of these stories about African migrants, and you will notice that some societies have more migrants than they have citizens. They have more migrants than they have citizens, which is a very important thing because this really dates back to the idea of how identity is attributed and how it is even attributed to individuals in this modern space that we live. So these Africans who migrate to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to Qatar, to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi, to all of these places, they are migrating for a number of reasons, but one of the principal reasons is economic. And closely behind the economic stimulation of their desire to increase their livelihood is the issue of political instability and being offered refuge. So if you go to Qatar, for example, you will find a very large Sudanese community. But this Sudanese community is extremely politicized. And they are politicized because Qatar has served as the base of negotiation. It served as the base of negotiation between the South and the North when that war was going on. And now it serves as a base of the opposition to the current regime in northern Sudan, and even the kind of factions fighting in southern Sudan. So you have this politicized community which is extremely connected to the politics and the place in the Sudan. So Africans continue to migrate out of Africa and into different parts of Asia. You have in the world these days a group of people who are brokers, if you will, for economic migrants, and they go and they hire large numbers of people to be transported to some of these countries in the Middle East and to some of the countries in Asia, and you will get streams of migrants coming there. You also get, for Asia, large numbers of Africans going for education as well, and all of the encounters that may arise. And there continues to be a steady stream of African migrants, that is, migrants from Africa to Europe, to various parts of Europe. A lot of very interesting documentaries and movies and books being written about this stream, if you will, of immigrants. And to the Americas. I mean, one of the places with the sharpest increase of African immigrants is Brazil. The number of migrants from the African continent, I think it increased by about 10 times between a certain period of time in Brazil. So the number is rising. And when they've asked these African immigrants about why are they migrating to Brazil, they have said that they find it very hospitable as being immigrants compared to some of the other areas that they go to, and that the rules and regulations or the laws for registering as a refugee or registering as a political refugee, that these things are much easier. I'm not saying they're easy in Brazil, but they're much easier in Brazil compared to some other places. And and so and also because Brazil also has a growing stream of immigrants from various Caribbean nations, particularly from Haiti as well, to some specific areas in Brazil. Migration of people of African descent to Africa, or migrations of people from these African diasporas, these last 4 African diasporas that I've been talking about, to Africa, is also there. It's a reality, and that should read 2 and 3, not 3 and 4. But I didn't get a chance to change it before I kind of put the 1 off there by itself. So just float with me. I'm thinking of 5 African diasporas. That's trying to make it so it's intelligible to everybody. But there is a movement of African descent people to Africa. And there's also the movement of the African diaspora, which continues to circulate among populations in Europe and the Americas, including the Caribbean, and moving from one place to another place. And this is producing a lot of very interesting conversations. In the United States, it's producing a conversation about what does it mean to be a Latino. I mean, if you arrive in the United States and you say I'm a Latino, and then they have in the United States, you know, people that call themselves, they have so-called black people and so-called white people in the United States. They call themselves different things at different times. But then when you come as a Latino, and you may come from a society where there is currently a debate around being so-called white or being so-called black, and now you arrive in a place where they're also having this debate. Just the contours of this, to me, are quite beautiful, because they're showing that we're maturing as human beings, because we stand not to accept the simple definitions of who we're supposed to be, and are contesting identity in interesting ways. Now, these migrations have had a profound impact on Africa and the African diaspora. They created the African diaspora, but they've also had a profound impact on Africa. The first big impact we have to admit that happens to Africa is that this significant loss of population, which, you know, I'm showing you something which would put you, you know, very close to between 70 to 100 million people, over a very long period of time, this constant stream out of the population of the most productive part of the population. Nobody went in to enslave elderly people. You can debate whether they took men or women and the value therefore, but nobody went in to take the elderly. And if they took babies, the survival rate for the babies was very, very low. So taking a baby, and, you know, and I know, the beautiful thing is you got a lot of pictures in Brazil showing things, and you can show some children on some of those boats. But, you know, those children, their numbers are very low. And their ability to survive the voyage and to survive the initiation and slave born in it, not having a social system of support in it, were known to be quite low. But the impact on Africa of snatching its most productive people for a period of roughly 300 years was devastating. Most demographic analysis of the past population of Africa puts the number at about 100 million between the period of 1100 all the way to the middle of the 19th century. Now that's important, because what that means is that any society would have been experiencing a depletion of some of its most robust and needed people. Okay, because you're going to take people in between a certain age range, and you're going to take them out of societies, therefore denying the society their contribution. And enslavement was not a voluntary process. Even if you had African collaborators in the process, it was a net drain on the African continent. This population level not growing in Africa was, if you compare that to the population in Asia, the estimates of that population, the estimates of populations in Europe, and the estimation of the growth of non-indigenous populations in the Americas, you notice that there is net growth. That is, the non-indigenous populations are experiencing net growth. So this tremendous transformation of the globe, in which you have this European diaspora and this African diaspora spreading very widely in the Americas and in Europe, and to some extent in Asia with the European diaspora, is having a very heavy devastation of the indigenous population, but it is also happening at a time when population is growing everywhere, and the population rates are increasing. In fact, this establishes a population base, okay, on which the human population growth would accelerate. This creates a population base. It's something that's usually not talked about for the wrong reasons, but it's usually not. But it establishes a population base by which the growth in the human population would accelerate. So around the end of the 19th century, there is a spike in human population growth, and we haven't slowed down. Now we're doubling our numbers at an accelerating rate, which is quite alarming to some, because they see that the planet does not have really the potential to carry as many humans as we humans can make, and that there needs to be more regulation of how we reproduce, and that we need to begin to develop policies which take into consideration a balance between who we are and the resources that exist on the earth. Okay, so that's all happening in the background, where what I'd like to call moments of freedom are also occurring. So when you get this enslavement, enslavement begins to end at the, as I said, the end of the 19th century. But this is also a point where the African continent begins to experience an acceleration of colonialism. The conference in Berlin in 1885, it kind of marks an effort by European nations to divide up the continent, with the idea that this division of the continent will further expand the resources, the value which can be obtained from Africa by the main European powers, and those powers primarily being the Western European powers of France and Britain. I mean, you know, World War II and World War I were both fought in part over Germany's displeasure with being left out of the great division of the African continent. Most of the people on the African continent were colonized within the British Empire. Most of the landmass on the African continent was colonized under the French Empire. So there was very little wiggle room for the Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, and the Spanish really got kicked out pretty early. And you know, what this colonialism did is that it marked how we entered the 20th century. So along with this entrance into the 20th century, there is this desire to, on one hand, justify this colonization in Africa. Right? It is to justify this increasing colonization on the African continent, why their societies needed to be governed. And this justification of the governance of African societies is in itself a way where there had to be a language of colonialism in the arguments about freedom. The arguments about freedom already had within its base a language of enslavement. Now you needed to add a language of colonialism that justified it. And this language of colonialism for Africa already, you didn't need a lot of experience because Europe had experience in Asia and the Americas, but they brought it. And it basically was a language of why European civilization, it's the same narrative that I've been talking about, why European civilization was bringing the best to humanity, the best in science, the best in medicine, the best in education, the best in religion. You know, you got really important scholars writing books that they would call the Protestant ethic. And they would say that the Protestant ethic is the reason that Europe developed faster than Africa and Asia, and is the reason that Europe was able to colonize Africa and Asia. That is, the reason for it was based in this kind of conflict around religion, which produced a Protestant ethic which is perfected in the capitalism, and especially the capitalism which develops in the United States. And the book that I'm talking about is The Protestant Ethic, written by Max Weber. But Adam Smith's tome also carries the same element, the same articulation, in which there needs to be a justification for why Europe could be talking about freedom on one hand and then enslaving and colonizing people on another hand. So that the language of democracy, the language of freedom, the language of kind of rational politics needed something like race, and it created it in order to differentiate among people. But at the same time, these Africans would engage in acts which would help us as human beings understand what freedom is about. Because the enslaved would fight against enslavement, and the colonized would fight against colonialism. So that enslavement, upon its ending, creates a space for another conversation about freedom. A conversation which I've suggested would be in a major way led by the formerly enslaved, because they would talk about the elements of the denial of freedom which existed in the notion of democracy. Democracy wasn't only an evolving idea, it is a flawed idea. And the fact that it could have the enslaved and have colonialism is the evidence of the flaw of it. But it has a strong ideological component which says that democracy is about freedom. And that is not what democracy is about. And even the early writers don't necessarily say that. So enslavement then fosters in another kind of conversation about freedom that occurs, you could say it occurs between the end of enslavement, which we could say that era ends in 1888 with the emancipation in Brazil, and goes all the way up to World War I, where there is now a big question about freedom being fought over the question of the colonies. And this is, in part, I suggested that it was fought because of a desire to deepen and expand colonization on the African continent. And it would get crystallized by World War II, because what World War II would mark is the end of the ability to justify even this classical form of colonialism which is developing, where France gets most of the land, Britain gets most of the people, Portugal gets a few countries, and a spatter of this and that is going on, but that basically Africa gets colonized. Well, now you can't justify it on any basis, because what happened in World War II is the extension of the Nazi idea extended the notion of colonialism. Because Hitler had the idea, get rid of the dirty white people and let's clean up the white race. Exterminate the Jews, get rid of the homosexuals, get rid of the poor people, and we can just enslave or re-enslave the black people. We can do some things. He had great plans to take racism to its logical, most extreme circumstance. And that included colonizing Poland. That included colonizing France. And not only did they colonize Poland and France, they treated Poland and France like they were Africans. They ripped out the infrastructure. They took more from Poland and France than they would give to Poland and France. So they treated, the Nazis treated Poland and France, two European countries, like they were Africans. And France likened itself to being the cultural heart of Europe and to be trampled by the industrial might of Germany and then kind of torn apart and asunder in the process, really represented a great challenge to the idea of the Europe that existed before the Cold War. So before World War II. So then after World War II, you get an entirely different conversation. And this conversation is that all people should have a say in their government, and this kind of tyranny should not exist, and we are all human beings. And no longer should we make these kinds of claims. So that in 48, you get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's debate around whether those human rights are political human rights or economic human rights, and the United States sustaining its political human rights stance, and the socialist countries sustaining that we had to include economic human rights as well. So this conversation is happening in the backdrop where formerly colonized people are demanding independence. Independence is being demanded in India, and they get it. Right? This is how Gandhi gets his fame. Independence is being demanded in Vietnam, right? And they get it. This is how Ho Chi Minh gains his fame. I mean, the French could not even continue to fight in Vietnam. They were being funded to fight by the United States, which by this time, was beginning to formulate its Cold War politics. And these Cold War politics were seen as a way to push back against socialism and its growing influence in the world, and to transform the interaction to be based on military activity rather than on any kind of appealing to the people's minds or anything like that. So, and the kind of decolonization of Africa and the companion movement for African independence really marks an important moment where these ideas come together, because it's complicated by the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union, the two new superpowers, neither of which benefited from colonialism, were both opposed to it. So they all raised arguments that there should be decolonization. And this is where you get France's decolonization program. You get Britain's decolonization program. You even get Portugal's decolonization program. I mean, their decolonization program is written in '74, so it's much later than the French and the British. But you get these ideas that decolonization has to happen. Well, the Africans who fought on the side of the British and the French and others in the war, in World War II, also situated themselves in this entire process to basically say, we want our freedom. So they would organize, Africans would organize meetings all over the world demanding African independence. One such meeting occurring right at the end of World War II, which was in 1945, and that's the Pan-African Congress, which happens in London. So the independence movement of Africa and the decolonization movement of Europe all happens at the same time, where the notion of the Cold War is evolving and developing. So that by 48, it's very clear that, the idea you're going to have an East Germany and a West Germany, you're going to have an East German currency and a West German currency, yet have the wall, because the wall didn't really get built into '62, but there is this kind of division of the world around the Cold War. You're either for socialism and the democracy that it talked about, or you're for capitalism and the democracy that it talked about. And the wars all happened not between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between often proxies for the United States and the Soviet Union, or forces that the United States and the Soviet Union supported differently. So that you would have one side of Vietnam fighting against another side of Vietnam and receiving support and political cover from either China or the Soviet Union and the United States on the other side. The same thing would happen in Korea. The same thing would happen in the Congo. The same thing would happen in Ghana. The same thing would happen all over the African continent. There was literally coup after coup after coup after coup on the African continent as a consequence of this. But these Cold War politics also influence the kind of politics that happened inside of nations where there were large African diaspora populations not on the African continent. So the politics of the Cold War influenced the kind of academic, the kind of organizations, political organizations that could be viably formed in places like the North America, the Caribbean, and Latin America. And in fact, the Cold War politics would surface in Latin America with a very brutal face, with lots of coups and lots of U.S. intervention into the domestic politics of what happened on this part of the American continent. Freedom and reparations probably mark the more recent point where these conflicts and spaces with large African and African diaspora populations are occurring. But the freedom and reparations issue is really big in the African diaspora these days, in the African diaspora in Europe, in the African diaspora in Latin America, and in North America. Questions of affirmative action, human rights, and reparations they loom very large. They're articulated in different ways, but they are very similar in that all are trying to address the second-class citizenship which continues to be an element of the existence of African diaspora populations within the various societies in these areas. The affirmative action, often, connected with movements for black empowerment, find themselves in the idea of getting spaces to integrate within the social and economic structure of the society, to gain economic power, to have resources and control over the environment. And then the idea of human rights and reparations. And this is being given new light more recently as African diaspora populations begin to demand a reconfiguration of the economic space. Now I offer this: if they're successful with reparations, if they're successful with getting reparations in the form of land and resources from corporations which have exploited space, they will change the configuration of how people protest within countries. What is up for stakes? What you can win? What you can get? To date, the successes have been tremendous in terms of people being allocated land and being promised spaces in institutions and resources to help facilitate restitution, to be made whole in a legal sense. That is, they were born into a situation in which they were less than whole, and that to be made whole, there needs to be a transference of resources and power. And they've been promised these things, often legislated these things in places like Brazil, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and Peru, and the United States. Yet we still are waiting to see what that unfolds out to be. And there really isn't a conclusion to this. This movement is still going on because it, unlike the independence movement, is not directed at a specific thing. Whereas the independence movement was directed at full participation in governance, and that probably, that is, independence movement, you could say in one way, ended in 1994 with the independence of South Africa. Now there's another wave of independence going on, Eritrea, Southern Sudan, in the many countries in which there are groups of people saying they will begin to contend for power, which they want independence from the African nation that they're a part of. But that's a new phase of this whole fight for independence, and it's really based on how people see who they are, how they identify themselves, and who they think is a legitimate, or what they think is a legitimate space for them to be governed in. The fight for the removal of second-class citizenship and reparations is a more deeply entrenched fight, because it is a fight for the transference of wealth and resources. And to do that, you almost need a reconsideration in societies about equality and opportunity to happen. In other words, you just have a space for continuing cycles of conflict, because it poses people, racial groups, in conflict with one another. Necessarily so, because race is always, as I've contended, about conflict around resources within societies. And this conflict around resources then leads to this moment exactly where we are. And that's why people get very excited when you start talking about race. And national conversations, at least I've noticed, that they get extremely tense when nations begin to have a conversation about race, and when people's consciousness about racial inequality and conflict begins to rise. There's a lot of racial tension around resources and what should be done to handle the problems of racial inequality and differences. Let me just offer a few concluding comments, and then if you like, I can take questions. Africana studies is a kind of artistic, scientific, and social scientific consideration of Africa and the African diaspora. And this, I think, is very important. It's a very important moment for Africana studies, because in the beginning I talked about the links across the globe between Africa and the African diaspora. Africana studies is the space for the study of these links. The first iteration of African studies and of African diaspora studies did a lot to try to disconnect these two. In some ways premised on the European narrative that I've been talking about, that, all this stuff began in 1500. So 500 years ago, the African cultural slate, the African intellectual slate, the African historical slate was wiped clean. And the African descendants, the African diaspora, started new. And Africa was left in the dark, frozen in a moment where they made nice masks and drums. And so this narrative, this distortion of history, has prevented us from having a kind of conversation which would even allow a reconstitution of the humanity of the Africans and a reconstitution of the humanities of the non-Africans, or the Asians, or the Europeans, or the indigenous. And we need to have that conversation, because no matter what, one thing that has to be admitted is that racial inequality has been persistent. People might have their reasons for justifying its existence, but the fact that it does exist. And I'm just assuming the humanity of Africans and assuming the humanity of the African diaspora. And by making that assumption, I am assuming that they would be interested in investigations which find out about this. And they would be interested in alternative interpretations so that they can engage in the appropriate types of interventions to change the situation. Thank you very much for your patience.